A quiet drizzle pattered against the fogged window of an old inn, nestled on the edge of an overgrown forest. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stop, the air heavy with the scent of damp wood and forgotten stories. Room 208 had been vacant for decades, whispered about in hushed tones by the innkeeper and avoided by guests without explanation. On a chilly autumn evening, Clara, a young traveler on her way to nowhere in particular, checked in, her worn suitcase leaving faint tracks on the dusty carpet. The innkeeper hesitated before handing her the brass key. "All the other rooms are full," he mumbled, barely meeting her gaze. As the heavy oak door of room 208 creaked open, a draft swept past Clara, carrying a faint metallic tang. The room was ordinary, modest furnishings, faded wallpaper, but the door closed with an eerie finality behind her. She tried the knob instinctively. It didn't budge. "Just stuck," she thought, laughing nervously to herself. But the strange sensation that someone or something was watching her from the shadows refused to leave. Clara slumped onto the bed, the springs groaning beneath her weight. She wasn't usually the type to stay in roadside inns, but her car had sputtered to a halt miles away, and the idea of walking through the forest in the dark wasn't appealing. The inn was quaint, but room 208 felt strangely off, as if the air itself was heavier. She unpacked her essentials, placing her journal and a book on the bedside table. As she opened her suitcase, a faint scratching noise caught her attention. She froze, her eyes darting to the corner of the room where an old wardrobe stood. Its doors were slightly ajar, revealing darkness within. "Probably just the wind," she muttered, trying to dismiss the thought. Clara wasn't the superstitious type. She'd spent her whole life chasing logical explanations, often jotting them down in her journal, which she called her guide to debunking the absurd. Still, something about the wardrobe made her uneasy. She shut it firmly and returned to her journal, documenting her journey so far, breaking down, finding the inn, and the strange silence of room 208. Outside, the drizzle had turned to rain, the rhythmic tapping against the window almost soothing. A knock interrupted her thoughts. It wasn't from the door but from the window, on the second floor. Startled, Clara approached cautiously, her breath fogging the glass as she peered out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the rain cascading down the pane. She turned back to the room, her unease growing. That's when she noticed it. The wardrobe doors were slightly open again, just as they had been when she first entered. The clock on the bedside table ticked loudly, counting the seconds in a room that now felt more like a trap than a place to rest. Clara tried the door again, twisting the knob until her hands hurt. It wouldn't budge. She banged on the wood, shouting for help, but her voice seemed swallowed by the room itself. It was as if room 208 didn't want her to leave. Clara paced the room, her heart thudding as she tried to rationalize the situation. The door might have swelled from the rain, she thought, or maybe the old lock had jammed. Still, the atmosphere pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket, and a faint scent of metal hung in the air. The wardrobe loomed in the corner, its door slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness inside. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the wardrobe was watching her. She grabbed a chair, wedging it under the doorknob for a sense of control, then approached the wardrobe with slow, deliberate steps. Gripping the handle, she yanked it open. Empty. Just a hollow, musty space, its corners shadowed and unremarkable. She laughed nervously, scolding herself for letting her imagination run wild. But as she closed the doors again, she noticed something strange, a faint carving on the inner edge of the wood. It was a word crudely scratched into the surface: stay. Her pulse quickened as she ran her fingers over the grooves. Had someone been locked in here before her? She backed away from the wardrobe, tripping slightly over the frayed edge of the carpet. The rain outside grew heavier, thunder rumbling in the distance. The lights flickered briefly, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the bulbs steadied again, Clara's breath hitched. The chair she'd wedged under the doorknob was now in the center of the room, perfectly upright. She hadn't heard it move. "Is someone here?" she called out, her voice trembling. She scanned the room, her gaze darting to the wardrobe, the corners, the bed. Nothing. But then she heard it, a faint hum, almost melodic, emanating from the walls. It was low and mournful, like a voice trapped in endless sorrow. Clara pressed her ear to the wall, trying to pinpoint the source. The hum grew louder, shifting into words she couldn't quite make out, until it stopped abruptly. Behind her, the wardrobe creaked open. Clara spun around, her back pressed to the wall. The doors of the wardrobe were wide open now, but what chilled her wasn't the emptiness inside, it was the mirror fixed to the back of the wardrobe. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't moving in sync. While Clara stood frozen in terror, her reflection smiled. Panicking, she grabbed the suitcase and hurled it at the wardrobe, shattering the mirror. Shards scattered across the floor, and the humming returned, louder and angrier this time. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening. She rushed to the window, desperate for escape, but it wouldn't open. She glanced back at the wardrobe. Among the broken glass lay another carved message, freshly etched into the wood. "You can't leave." The room felt alive now, breathing, watching, pulsating with an energy that Clara couldn't comprehend. The walls seemed to lean inward, the faint hum transforming into an oppressive chorus of whispers. Each voice overlapped the other, too faint to decipher, but loud enough to chill her to the bone. Clara crouched against the wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She reached for her phone, hoping to call for help, but the screen was blank and unresponsive. A faint glow caught her attention. The shards of the shattered mirror reflected a dim light, though the room itself remained dark. Crawling toward the wardrobe, she peered into the jagged fragments. The glow was coming from the mirror's remains, but it wasn't a reflection of her room. The shards showed another place entirely, dim corridors lined with doors, each one identical to the one she'd been trapped behind. Shadows flitted past in the reflections, human shapes with hollow eyes and twisted faces. One by one, the figures turned toward her. In every shard, dozens of eyeless faces locked onto Clara, their mouths opening wide in silent screams. She stumbled back, but the shards began to vibrate, levitating off the floor and swirling around her like angry bees. "Why are you doing this?" she screamed, her voice cracking. The hum grew louder, a single voice breaking through the cacophony. It was cold, emotionless, and unbearably close. "Stay, feed the room." Clara froze as the door behind her opened, not outward, but inward, as if the room itself had expanded. Beyond the doorway was no hallway, no escape route. It was the same endless corridor she'd seen in the shards, stretching into a void. A cold wind sucked at her, pulling her toward the doorway. She gripped the bedpost, but the pull was relentless, dragging her closer to the yawning blackness. The walls whispered around her, "You belong to the room now, you always did." With a final gasp, Clara lost her grip, tumbling through the doorway into the corridor. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside the endless maze. Back in room 208, the doorknob turned. The door creaked open, revealing a clean, empty room. The air was still. The innkeeper stood outside, a sad smile on his face, as he placed the brass key back onto the hook behind the front desk. "Room 208 is ready," he murmured, "for the next one." The inn remained silent as the hours passed, the rain fading into a soft drizzle. The other guests went about their evenings, oblivious to the fate of the young woman who had vanished into room 208. The innkeeper sat at the desk, sipping his tea, staring at the key to room 208, as if it carried the weight of centuries. The room itself was quiet now, no longer pulsing with energy. The wardrobe stood closed, its jagged shards of mirror gone, replaced by a pristine pane of glass. A faint glow radiated from within the wardrobe, but it disappeared as soon as the door creaked shut. Deep within the endless corridor, Clara wandered aimlessly. The walls of the maze were featureless, and the whispering voices had faded to a faint hum. She clutched her journal tightly, the only thing that had followed her into this purgatory. As she flipped through its pages, she saw new entries she hadn't written, descriptions of others who had been trapped before her. "I'll find a way out," she murmured to herself, her voice trembling. But deep down, she knew the truth. The room had taken her, just as it had taken the others. And it was waiting for the next. Back at the inn, the brass key to room 208 gleamed under the dim light, waiting for its next visitor, just as the room had, for as long as anyone could remember.